You said a moment ago that 702 cannot be used to target Americans, correct? But that's cold comfort, isn't it, to the 278,000 people or tens of thousands of people who are the subject of 278,000 improper searches, United States persons that we're talking about in 2022 alone. I mean, sure, the statute doesn't permit them to be targeted, but when they have their personal information directly queried at an improper search, I mean, what's the difference?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And obviously, if there's noncompliance with the rules, that's a big problem. And if there's any suggestion that things are being done for political purposes or other improper motives, that's a big problem. It's something I've written about many times. I think there is some comfort for Americans, even if they're queried, from the fact that foreign intelligence targets overseas are the people on whom this collection is based.
Why? Why would that be?
That is a big.
Why would that make me feel any better? As, by the way, as someone who's had his cell phone tapped improperly by the United States government, by the way, why would I feel any better if I'm told that, oh, the U.S. government improperly queried your personal information, and not, in this case, just your location or something else, your personal communications. The government looked at those, targeted them, you can use whatever verb you want, found them out. But don't worry, they weren't going after you in the first instance, they just happened to have all your stuff, and so then they looked into it because there are no effective constraints on them. I mean, why is that a good thing? Shouldn't we do something about that?
I'll say I think members of Congress do have a heightened reason for concern, a heightened expectation of safeguards in this area. Members of Congress have every right and every reason to talk to foreign officials. And of course, the executive
What about
branch
journalists? What about normal Americans who is somebody who's got a family member who lives overseas? I don't care who the person is. My point is, when you've got in a single year 278,000 improper queries, it seems to me it makes no difference to the Americans whose data was improperly searched to say, well, but it's really okay because you weren't targeted. Yeah, all your stuff was read, all your private stuff, but don't worry, you weren't targeted. I mean, apparently you were effectively targeted.
Yeah, Senator, I think we have to remember this data is being collected on foreign intelligence targets overseas. It's not like going to the phone company and checking all the phone records that are there.
But it sweeps in quite a bit of American data, right? I mean, the case, the Hasbadrami court noted that in 2011, now that's ancient history now, 2011 alone, this swept in something like 250 million emails. In 2011, who knows what that is today? We're talking about massive amounts of data that 702 sweeps. It's like a dragnet, huge amounts of data. Which leads me to the question, why shouldn't we treat a query of an American person in this database as a separate Fourth Amendment event?
Yes, Senator, I just want to note that the second narrowing function is the FBI is only getting 3% of the overall target set from this. So it's a subset of a subset that's being checked. And there, in most cases, there's nothing there.
Why shouldn't there be? Why shouldn't we treat? Why isn't it logical, as the court said in Hasbadrami, the Second Circuit unanimously? Why shouldn't we treat the querying of U.S. persons out of this dragnet database? Why shouldn't we treat that as a separate Fourth Amendment event, requiring some additional process? Maybe a warrant, as Senator Lee has proposed. Maybe some other process, but why shouldn't we say, you know, actually, yes, when you go to this massive database and ask about a U.S. person, that's a Fourth Amendment event that requires some process, some scrutiny.
Yes, and so there are two answers to that. One is a legal answer, and we've covered that a lot, but in short, we don't require the FBI agent to get a warrant before going to check the filing cabinet.
Yeah, but this is totally analogous to that, as the Hasbadrami court said, right?
Sensitive records.
And as indeed the U.S. Supreme Court said in Riley. I mean, this is a completely analogous to saying that you have a piece of information down in a locker somewhere that you got pursuant to probable cause and indeed a warrant for a particular case. Here you have a massive dragnet of information. You just told me a second ago that you couldn't target the American citizens. So none of this information with the American citizens has received any process whatsoever. But now the FBI or the NSA, whomever, can go and query this database for the first time and get information on U.S. citizens, particularly for the first time, and you're telling me that that's not a separate Fourth Amendment event?
Well, Senator, I don't know what the first time. And when this information comes across the transom, there's an analyst, let's say at NSA, who's monitoring that target, or at the FBI, if it's one of their investigations, and they can read the whole thing.
It's the first time that the U.S. person has been the subject of inquiry, though. It has to be under the statute, because you told me a second ago you can't target a U.S. person.
Right.
It's got to be purely incidental. And the statute also says you can't target a foreign person for the purpose of getting information on a U.S. person through the back door. So it therefore follows that when you go to query the database later, query a U.S. person in the database, that's the first time the U.S. person is the subject of the inquiry. And my question to you is, that looks an awful lot like a search and seizure for a Fourth Amendment purposes. Why shouldn't we say, yeah, okay, that's a Fourth Amendment event. We need some additional process around that.
Yeah, and Senator, I think the government has already collected this information. In many cases, an analyst may have sat there and read the email. To me, it seems passing strange to say that someone has a reasonable expectation of privacy still in something that an intelligence analyst has sat there and read as it came across in their collection stream.
It just seems to me you can't have it both ways. You can't say that there's no targeting of U.S. persons that's forbidden under the statute, but then when they do want to actually target a U.S. person, they don't need any process for it. You're saying on the one hand, no process needed on the front end, no process needed on the back end. I just think, Mr. Chairman, this is an extremely, extremely important issue. 278,000 improper queries of Americans in 1 year alone. The idea that we would renew 702 without some sort of reforms to protect U.S. citizens, I think is just totally irresponsible.
Senator Schiff.
Section 702 allows the U.S. government to collect communications of foreign targets overseas. But Hawley zeroed in on what happens when Americans' data gets swept up in the process. He cited a staggering number: 278,000 improper queries of U.S. persons in 2022 alone. Although officials insist the law prohibits targeting Americans, Hawley argued that's little comfort if Americans' emails and private communications are still being searched. What's the difference? Hawley pressed. All your private stuff was read, but don't worry, you weren't targeted. The core constitutional issue: whether searching an American's name inside this massive intelligence database should count as a separate Fourth Amendment search, requiring a warrant. Hawley suggested that querying a U.S. citizen in the database is effectively a new search and should require additional legal process. Intelligence officials pushed back, arguing the data was already lawfully collected under Foreign Intelligence Authority. But Hawley wasn't convinced. He warned that renewing Section 702 without reform would be totally irresponsible, pointing to what he described as a dragnet system sweeping up massive amounts of American data. This debate highlights a growing bipartisan concern: national security versus civil liberties, foreign surveillance versus incidental collection of Americans' data, whether current safeguards are enough. The real fight isn't about spying on foreign adversaries. It's about what happens when American citizens' information gets caught in the net. This exchange shows just how divided Congress is over surveillance reform. On one hand, intelligence agencies argue Section 702 is essential for tracking terrorism and foreign threats. On the other hand, lawmakers like Hawley argue that incidental collection has turned into routine backdoor searches of Americans. And 278,000 improper queries? That number alone is political dynamite. The big question now: will Congress renew 702 as is, or add stronger warrant requirements for Americans? Because once surveillance powers are expanded, history shows they rarely shrink.